The French Open has always been a stage where history feels larger than life, where icons have broken down in tears, champions have been born beneath the glow of Parisian nights, and unforgettable moments become part of tennis folklore. Yet, even a tournament built on legacy seemed unprepared for the surreal scene that unfolded when one of the world's most celebrated DJs unexpectedly transformed the atmosphere and delivered a tribute to Eala. David Guetta has performed for audiences numbering in the millions, dominated global stages, and headlined events as massive as Tomorrowland, creating career-defining moments across continents. But on this day, his most unexpected performance came beside a tennis court in Paris. As spectators relaxed between matches on court Suzanne Lenglen at the French Open, the 58-year-old French music icon stepped into view holding a microphone and began performing a tribute dedicated to 20-year-old Filipina rising star Eala. The reaction was immediate and almost cinematic. Ball kids stopped where they stood, Philippine flags lowered, the surrounding noise dissolved, and chants that had echoed through the venue slowly disappeared into complete silence. Even Eala herself, a player portrayed as fearless after standing across the net from world number 2 Elena Rybakina, appeared stunned into silence from the players' area. Inside Roland Garros, fans struggled to process what they were witnessing, and one question spread instantly through the tennis world. Why would one of France's biggest music legends choose to honor a young tennis player before the tournament had even officially started? The moment was framed as taking place on May 22, 2026, only days before the French Open main draw was scheduled to begin on May 24th. By then, the grounds of Roland Garros Stadium were already alive with practice sessions, qualifying rounds, media activity, and thousands of fans absorbing the energy surrounding the season's second Grand Slam. Organizers had planned a series of small musical performances throughout the week to entertain early arrivals between matches, typically local performers, marching bands, and brief intermissions that rarely stayed in memory. But no one expected this appearance to become the emotional highlight of the tournament before a single main draw ball had been struck. According to the story, Guetta had not been announced on the entertainment schedule at all. The appearance had reportedly been kept secret until the final moment, presented as a surprise organized by tournament director Amélie Mauresmo, who allegedly wanted to create something unforgettable for fans gathering ahead of opening day. Earlier that morning, she was described as smiling when asked about the mystery guest and explaining that they wanted to create something special for spectators, adding that Guetta's connection to Paris and love for tennis made the idea possible, and that once she mentioned Eala to him, he insisted on being part of the moment. What began as a quiet afternoon on court Suzanne Lenglen quickly turned into something no one inside Roland Garros could have anticipated. At first, only a few hundred early spectators occupied the stands, casually watching warm-ups and waiting for the next round of practice sessions, creating the kind of calm atmosphere that usually fills tournament grounds before the main event begins. But the mood shifted instantly when whispers spread through the venue that David Guetta had arrived. Fans started moving toward the court from every direction, leaving nearby practice areas and gathering in waves. Within minutes, the lower sections filled completely, and before long, thousands had abandoned everything else happening around the grounds just to see what was unfolding. Then the lights dropped. Guetta took his place behind the DJ decks, and the crowd erupted. He launched into some of his most recognizable hits, including Titanium, When Love Takes Over, and Memories, instantly transforming the setting from a tennis venue into something that felt more like a world-class music festival. Spectators danced between rows, waved flags overhead, sang every word, and raised their phones into the Paris evening as the energy across Roland Garros intensified into something electric. Then, at the peak of the celebration, everything stopped. The music cut out. Guetta stepped forward, lifted the microphone, and his voice echoed through the stadium as he quietly addressed the crowd. He said he had a special request and explained that someone present had inspired him. Someone who likely had no idea he even knew who she was, yet someone he had been following from afar. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. Every person leaned in. He continued by saying she was not French and not European, but from the Philippines, a nation of more than 110 million people that had found inspiration in a 20-year-old girl carrying nothing more than a racket and a dream. Cameras immediately turned toward the player area where Eala sat alongside her mother Riza and members of her team, Joan Bosch, Luke Bambridge, and Sandro Van. Her expression shifted instantly. Her eyes widened, and one hand rose to cover her mouth as the realization settled in. Guetta smiled, pointed toward her section, and delivered the words that sent the stadium into complete eruption. "Alex, this song is for you." Thousands of voices exploded at once, chanting her name beneath the lights of Paris, and in that moment, David Guetta, an artist whose career spans hundreds of songs, global chart-topping productions, collaborations with some of music's biggest names, and performances before audiences numbering in the hundreds of thousands, began to sing in tribute as the tennis court became the center of an unforgettable spectacle. What unfolded that afternoon on court Suzanne Lenglen at the French Open felt unlike anything fans had ever associated with David Guetta before. This was not another global anthem built for charts, not a festival remix designed for massive crowds, and not a performance created to chase streams or dominate radio playlists. Instead, what he presented for Eala was imagined as something intimate and unexpected, an original tribute written specifically in her honor, a moment no one inside the stadium had anticipated. The instant the opening notes spread across Roland Garros, the mood transformed completely. A gentle piano melody floated through the venue like evening air moving across Paris, replacing the celebration, movement, and festival energy that had filled the stands only moments earlier. Phones slowly lowered. Philippine flags became still. Conversations vanished until silence settled over the court. Guetta closed his eyes, moved closer to the microphone, and began to sing words that painted the image of a young athlete carrying the hopes of an entire nation from Manila to Madrid while refusing to break under pressure. The lyrics were portrayed as raw, emotional, and untouched by perfection in a way that made them feel genuine rather than produced. There were no dramatic effects, no elaborate staging, and no spectacle. Only a performer, a piano, and a deeply emotional dedication offered to an athlete he had never personally met. As the chorus returned with lines describing Alex's name being called and her journey stretching from Rome to Paris while igniting something larger than herself, cameras found Eala sitting motionless in the players' area beside her mother, Riza, and her coaching staff. One hand remained over her mouth as she tried to absorb the moment unfolding around her, while tears gathered in her eyes. Her mother was described as openly emotional, and the coaches sat in stunned silence as they watched the scene unfold. Across the venue, thousands of spectators became so quiet that even distant sounds beyond Roland Garros Stadium seemed audible between the piano notes. Then the performance continued with lyrics describing the doubts placed on her. People saying she was too small, saying she could not succeed, only for her to answer on the clay court itself. With every line, the emotional intensity grew. The song suggested that no trophy, ranking, or title could equal the connection she shared with her supporters and the pride carried by those behind her. By the second verse, the performance had evolved into something the crowd imagined they would never forget. Guetta's voice rose and filled every corner of the stadium as the chorus returned once more, encouraging Alex never to lower her gaze and reminding her that the Philippines would stand beside her wherever her journey led. Spectators throughout the stands began crying openly. Some pressed their hands against their hearts while others quietly joined in despite hearing the words for the first time. Then, as the final piano note dissolved into the Paris air, no one reacted. For several long seconds, court Suzanne Lenglen remained completely still, as though the entire stadium needed a moment to breathe and understand what it had just experienced before the silence finally released its hold. What followed was not the explosive frenzy of a concert crowd or the overwhelming noise that usually accompanies one of David Guetta's biggest performances. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more emotional. Applause swept across court Suzanne Lenglen in waves, carrying the force of thunder mixed with emotion, cheers, and voices that began as a soft chant in the front rows before spreading through the entire stadium. Soon, thousands were repeating Alex's name together as Philippine flags moved proudly beneath the lights of Roland Garros. Guetta stepped away from the microphone and appeared overcome himself, his eyes reflecting the emotion of the moment as he turned toward the players' section where Eala remained frozen in disbelief. Her hand still covered her mouth, her shoulders subtly shaking as she tried to contain the emotions building inside her. Guetta pointed gently in her direction and quietly delivered a message, dedicating the moment not only to her, but to every Filipino who had ever experienced the feeling of being far from home, reminding them they were never truly alone. The response was immediate and even louder than before, but Alex still seemed unable to move. Cameras closed in on her face, while viewers around the world watched what was portrayed as an unusually vulnerable moment from one of tennis's fastest rising young stars. Tournament staff had arranged for a brief interview after the performance, and a reporter stood nearby holding a microphone, waiting to hear her reaction. Fans leaned forward, expecting words worthy of the moment they had just witnessed. Slowly, Alex stood and walked toward the front of the players' area. She looked out across the stadium, toward the sea of Philippine flags, toward supporters who had traveled across Europe to see her, and finally toward the man who had just performed an original tribute in her honor. She tried to speak, but nothing came. The emotion became too much all at once. The music, the chants, the expectations, the sacrifices, memories of Manila, and the feeling of carrying the hopes of an entire nation beneath the Paris sky. For several seconds, she simply stood there, gently shaking her head while trying to smile through tears. Then, in a voice so quiet the stadium almost missed it, she apologized and admitted she had no words for what she had just experienced. Instead of disappointment, the crowd answered with even stronger applause. There were no complaints, no impatience, only encouragement. Thousands stood together and continued chanting her name as the moment grew into something that felt larger than tennis itself. Voices from the stands called out in support, telling her that words were unnecessary because their support remained unchanged. Guetta, still near the stage, lifted his hand and calmly added one final message through the microphone, telling her she did not need to explain anything and asking only that she continue fighting. Alex responded with a quiet nod, tears still visible in her eyes, placing one hand against her chest before taking one final look across the stadium and slowly returning to her seat. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it was imagined as becoming one of the defining images of the French Open build-up, a brief moment of silence and emotion under the Paris lights that would soon be replayed millions of times. As clips spread across the internet, people began to treat it as more than a tennis highlight. Within minutes, videos of the tribute flooded every platform: TikTok, Instagram, X, YouTube, shared, remixed, reposted, and endlessly discussed. Comment sections filled with emotional reactions from viewers across the world, many focused on one detail above everything else. She had been left completely speechless. That was the moment people imagined proved how powerful it all had become, not because a title had been won or a record had been broken, but because someone of David Guetta's stature was portrayed as creating an original tribute for a tennis player still early in her career, a gesture framed as recognition rather than reward. To many watching, that became the definition of what they called the Eala effect. Across the Philippines and far beyond its borders, reactions poured in almost immediately. Headlines emerged within hours, with Philippine outlets describing the moment as a cultural milestone and presenting it as evidence that Eala had grown into something larger than sport alone. One headline framed the story around David Guetta performing for Alex at Roland Garros, while another described it as the song that brought Paris to a standstill. French coverage echoed the admiration but approached it differently, portraying the scene as unusually genuine in an era often associated with carefully engineered celebrity moments. Commentators described it as one of those rare occasions where music, competition, and emotion appeared to intersect naturally, where a globally recognized performer chose not to spotlight himself or deliver a familiar hit, but instead created a moment centered entirely on someone else. Reports reflected on the visible presence of Filipino supporters, suggesting that although the community in France is relatively modest in official estimates, the atmosphere inside court, Suzanne Lenglen felt exponentially larger because of the flags, chants, and emotion filling the venue. The interpretation offered was that people were not putting on a performance. They were seeing themselves reflected in the journey unfolding before them. Even the Women's Tennis Association was imagined as acknowledging the wave of attention surrounding Eala with a carefully measured public message expressing appreciation for the support shown to both her and the Filipino community, emphasizing that tennis reaches its highest form when it connects people across borders and presenting the so-called Eala effect as an example of sport extending beyond competition. Publicly, the response remained diplomatic, but the narrative suggested that behind the scenes there was a growing awareness that the story had evolved beyond a typical tennis storyline and into something cultural in scale. Yet the emotional peak did not end when cameras shut off. According to the scene being described, after the crowd dispersed, the stage emptied, and David Guetta quietly disappeared back into the Paris afternoon. The atmosphere inside the players' area became almost surreal. Alex remained seated in silence, staring across the now empty court as if trying to process everything that had just unfolded. The red clay of Roland Garros Stadium, the vacant seats, and the fading memory of a song written in her honor lingered around her like something unreal. Then she quietly turned to her mother, Riza, and asked whether it had truly happened. Her mother, still emotional, smiled and reassured her that it had. Alex reportedly struggled to understand the depth of the support, questioning why people cared so deeply and insisting she had not yet won enough or fully proven herself. Her mother responded gently, telling her that recognition is not always measured in trophies or rankings, that people see heart, persistence, and the refusal to give up, and that those qualities were what connected with supporters and what they believed others had recognized in her as well. After a long silence, Alex stood and walked toward the front of the players' box, looking out over the empty stadium, the clay beneath her feet, and the Paris sky overhead. Then she made a quiet promise, not about titles or rankings, not even about immediate victories, but about earning belief, honoring support, and making people proud. She said she did not know when the wins would come or what form they would take, but she promised to fight, to keep going, and to carry the people who believed in her through every point, every game, and every match. The room stayed silent after her words, and then her mother stepped forward and embraced her. Her mother pulled her closer and whispered the words that seemed to bring the entire moment into focus, that this was all anyone had ever wanted from her. Not perfection, not trophies, not impossible expectations, only the willingness to keep fighting and keep showing up. The French Open itself was still days away. The draw had not been finalized, no points had been played, and the world remained suspended in anticipation. Yet inside that quiet space after the applause had faded, it felt as though something meaningful had already been settled. The music had been played, the emotions had surfaced, the flags had filled the air, and Alex Eala, the 20-year-old from Manila still chasing her first breakthrough at Roland Garros, had made a promise she imagined carrying into every match that followed. Long after clips stopped trending and attention moved elsewhere, one image remained fixed in people's minds: a young player sitting silently in the player's box, overwhelmed by emotion and suddenly standing at the center of something that seemed to reach beyond tennis. In this telling, the song Laban did not end in Paris. Its meaning continued outward, imagined through choirs singing in Manila, street performers carrying the melody through London, and overseas Filipino workers in Dubai, quietly connecting with a story that felt familiar to them. But none of that changed the reality waiting ahead. No draw had been set. No opening ball had been struck. The true challenge still lived on the court. The question became whether a promise made in an emotional moment could survive the pressure and weight that competition brings. Alex had said she wanted to win, but not only in the traditional sense. The goal she described reached beyond lifting a trophy. She wanted to earn belief, protect trust, and make people proud. That became the question hanging over everything that followed. When she eventually walks onto court Philippe Chatrier for her opening match at the French Open,